to remember that there's a disclaimer, I guess, that any discussion items we talk about here aren't endorsed by the Illinois State Board of Education or ISU. As content specialists, we support the State Board of Education, but we are housed through the Center for Educational Initiatives at Illinois State University. So we're very glad to have you here today joining us. Again, in that chat window for you, I pasted a few things bits of information that might be helpful. If you're not part of our listserv, if that's a lot of you, it looks like heard about us through the listserv, but if you're not, the link to the listserv is there. The link to our Illinois Social Studies Com page is there. That's where the archive of this will be located after we're done. If you also want to, would really be great if at the end of this you could fill out a post survey for us and let us know some future topics you'd be interested in hearing about and some other information about today's session. That would be wonderful. So that post survey link is already in the chat window for you. If you kind of hover near the bottom, there should be kind of a more is where mine usually pops out of it. It says chat. In the chat window there were those links for you if you wanted to take a look at those in a minute. Any questions before we get started? Awesome. Hi, I see a couple of you there. Erickson, I see two people. Nice to see you all. Trying to look. Awesome. All right. So as I mentioned today, we just kind of wanted to kick this off by talking about some standards and resources. Some of this may be very familiar to you depending on how deeply you've dived into the social studies standards so far. What I think is really important to remember is when we look at why these new standards came about, let's think about what our goals are for our students for the future. So we mean our kids once they leave us, right? You know, K-12, even if I teach second grade, when my students leave me, I really want to make sure that they have the skills they need to be functional citizens. And I don't just mean citizens in the United States, right? We mean global citizens. How do I participate in our country? How do I function? I'm in a democracy. How do I be a well-rounded adult, right? How to manage my money, manage my finances, know how to participate in government, those sorts of things. In order for our students to do that, they really need to be able to understand and interpret information and draw their own conclusions, right? How much of our society now is looking at a variety of sources talking about the same story and trying to figure out which news story is more accurate or which one has some bias and which one has bias one way and which one has bias another way. So those sorts of ideas are the skills and concepts that we need our kids to understand. So you'll notice when you looked at the new standards that there's a lot of emphasis on that. So there's this movement towards allowing our students to take some ownership of their learning and to truly understand the material that we're talking about. So getting them engaged in the curriculum through inquiry and focusing more on the why things are happening and the impact of those events and a little bit less on the memorization of dates and names. Now, don't panic. That doesn't mean you can't study content. That does mean rather than memorizing every battle in the Civil War, let's understand why the Civil War happened and what the immediate impact of the Civil War was and what the long-lasting impact of that has been, right? So yes, we can talk about the battles, but maybe regurgitating that raw list isn't the information I want my kids to be able to absorb. Maybe it's the bigger impact and understanding. So if you've looked at the new social studies standards, you'll notice that they focus on a lot of those things. Our shifts are based on the C3 framework. So since most of you have your cameras on, can I have a little show of hands? Is anybody familiar with the C3 framework? So the C3 framework is the College Career and Civic Life Framework, and it came from the National Council for the Social Studies, I want to say in 2016-ish. And no, before then, 2014. They put out this framework to talk about what shifts in instruction we're looking for from our students. Our standards are very, very, very closely aligned to the C3 framework. So in Illinois here, it's hard to find some specific resources for Illinois unless they're on our site, which we'll show you here in a little bit. But if you look at resources that are C3 aligned, you should be on the right track as well to help support you and your teachers in the classroom. So our new standards are really asking students to get engaged in the process that lets them craft questions that spark and sustain an inquiry. We're asking them to cultivate and nurture collaborative and civic spaces. Now, we don't mean just the physical space in your classroom, though we could arrange that, I suppose. we mean, how do I have a civil discussion with my peers? If I disagree with someone, if I want to share opinions, how do I do that? I think we could probably agree that that's a skill a lot of adults don't always have right now. So we need to get our kids practicing that, right? There's no way that everybody just inherently knows that. So how do I let them collaborate to share ideas and have this civil discussion in class? There's this idea that we need to integrate content and skills purposefully. So teaching the content, but emphasizing the skills, the long-lasting skills that go with that are going to be really important. Promoting literacy practices and outcomes is one of our big shifts. Now, this is my favorite, and it's not my favorite for the same reason it's Kathy's favorite. Since Kathy's an ELA person, she loves literacy, and I do too, don't get me wrong. What I really like about this shift, though, is it's talking really about being literate in the social sciences. So how do I become historically literate? How do I become economically literate, geographically literate, civically literate? Like, so what does that mean in the classroom, and what does that look like? Getting them to become fluent in those areas as well. And then our final shift is providing tangible opportunities for taking informed action. This is sort of a when and where appropriate. Can our kids do something connected to their learning in class that extends beyond the classroom? Okay, we're looking for them to take that action. If we want our kids to be well-rounded citizens, we want to make sure that as an adult, if they disagree with something and want to go to the school board, that they know how to do that, right? So let's give them the opportunity to practice that in class. Really, the new standards aren't forcing us to change what we teach in class. They're asking us to change how our kids are engaging with the material and how we're engaging with our students in the classroom. So in general, K-12, our standards are divided into two pieces that work together. There's inquiry skills and disciplinary concepts. So if you think about it this way, our inquiry skills are really the methods we use to accomplish our disciplinary concepts. So those are divided up into three pieces, and they mirror the dimensions of the C3 framework and form a big inquiry arc overall. So the first is developing questions and planning inquiries. And we want our kids engaged in that questioning process as much as possible. Evaluating sources and using evidence, and communicating conclusions and taking informed action. And what I really like about those is if you kind of think about it, if you put those three together, we're really talking about what I do in the course of an inquiry, right? First, I need to have some questions and think about what I want to investigate. Then I need to look at a bunch of sources and gather some evidence. And then I need to do something with what I've learned. I need to share it with someone, or I need to take some action upon that, right? So putting those three together kind of forms a big inquiry arc. And the goal, of course, would be that in a unit, we're getting through that inquiry arc, not just in your single everyday lesson sort of situation, okay? Our disciplinary concepts look a little bit more content specific, though again, they're not a list of topics to study. Okay? They're divided into four categories: K-12, civics, geography, economics, which includes financial literacy, and history. And the goal is, no matter what your course is called, so if you teach 9th grade geography, you may focus on the geography standards at that level, but hopefully we're looking for the other areas as well and trying to integrate those as well. And you'll notice when you look at your grade level standards for that they're not focusing on this memorization of facts or dates or names, but really bigger, deeper understandings. And that the specific content you teach, so we are a 5th grade class, our course has typically been US history. What do the standards say I have to teach at 5th grade? There's a little bit of guidance about conceptual understandings in the standards, but the state mandates still apply. Those didn't go away. So the mandates and your current curriculum and the standards can kind of be incorporated to let your district make some local decisions about what content is covered at each grade level. Just keep in mind, we're thinking about how can our students access this content. So the inquiry skills are helping us with the how, and the disciplinary concepts are helping us with the what is the content information. So the standards look very similar K-12 in the sense that they all have an inquiry skills and a disciplinary concepts, but there are a few key differences depending on the grade level you're working with. So if you are an elementary teacher, or if you look at the elementary standards, you'll notice that they're based on themes that are aligned to the disciplinary concepts. Elementary, your inquiry skills are grade banded. So K1, 2, you're practicing the same inquiry skills. We're not expecting a kindergartner to have mastery of those. We want kind of that repeated practice over those 3 years. And then of course, 3, 4, 5 are a banded inquiry skill as well. You'll notice from the themes, the elementary group that wrote the standards really tried to focus on themes that are things you may already be doing in the classroom. So when I think about what my son is doing in kindergarten, a lot of the beginning of the year and even till now is, what does it look like to behave appropriately at school, right? What does it look like to walk in a line appropriately? What are the different roles of people at my school? What's my role within this world? So kindergarten is my social world, and some of those standards are focusing on similar concepts. And then the picture kind of gets broader from there. So living, learning, and working together, families, neighborhoods, and communities near and far. Fourth grade, our state, our nation, may be a shift for some districts. I know sometimes, usually somewhere we've studied Illinois history, right? Fourth grade has an emphasis on Illinois, so that doesn't mean that's all you have to study, but there is an emphasis on Illinois in our fourth grade standards. And then our nation, our world is fifth grade. Middle school looks a little different. Middle school is kind of a different animal. And I feel like I can say that. I was a middle school teacher for 12 years before I started this role. So the middle school is banded by levels of complexity rather than grade levels. And that was done for a few reasons. Middle school kids, with the hormonal changes in their body and everything that's going on in those 3 years, they vary so much in those 3 years that sometimes you may have an eighth grader that reads and behaves and comprehends and acts like a high schooler, and sometimes you'll have one that's like a fourth grader, right? So there's this variation there in the middle school to allow for some of that. And that's also there because the state doesn't dictate the curriculum at the middle school. So we know that everybody has to study the US and Illinois Constitution somewhere, but the grade that happens varies. So if they're banded, the levels of complexity allow you as a district to have a little bit of flexibility in that as well. We also know that most classrooms have a wide variety of ability levels, and hopefully this allows different grades to target different complexity bands to be able to, by the end of eighth grade, let students have practiced and experienced all three. So again, we're not asking for the phrasing of the standards is exactly that, practiced and experienced, not necessarily calling for every student to have mastery of the most complex level, but asking for everybody to have experienced and practiced all of those. High school has the same 4 disciplinary concepts. It also has some supplementary, a psychology, sociology, and anthropology. Those are if you have the ability to offer those. Their goal, again, as I kind of mentioned earlier, is cross-curricular integration. So if I teach a history class, not just focusing on the history standards, but what else can I incorporate? And their goals are to get overarching themes of what students should know and be able to do at the end of the required high school social science courses. The high school group wanted to make sure to stress that it's a baseline and not a ceiling. We can, of course, push our students beyond any of those standards, but those are the baseline for what we want our students to know and be able to do. What does this mean then, right? There's a bunch of shifts. There's some new standards that are coming out. What am I actually seeing change in my classroom? I think there's a few key ideas that are going to become more and more important. So one is the teacher is kind of becoming a facilitator of learning rather than the only source of information. So rather than all day, every day, me standing and lecturing and giving you information as a student, our goal is to focus more on some planned units of inquiry that focus on essential questions. That they're thinking about, why am I studying this and what do I really want my kids to understand at the end of this, right? Those should be the goals of our units. Hopefully allowing our students the time to process the information and draw conclusions. So I know that we've all probably experienced and done perhaps here's this and here's why it's important, right? I drew the conclusion for my kids a lot. We want our kids to work on that, and that's a hard piece, and we know that, but helping them through that process is kind of what the standards are asking us to move towards. And I always like to remind everybody that you're still the expert in the room. Ask some questions, but by all means, if they go way off base into left field, draw them back in and clarify things, right? Don't let them kind of spin out of control. I think another key idea is that we need to really engage our students in the topic that we're studying and allow them to be asking some questions. Kids are so naturally curious, right? I think somewhere along the way, sometimes they get used to not asking as many questions or not getting as comfortable with that. So let's let them ask questions. if I tell my kids or my students, what are you interested about the Revolutionary War? The only kids that are going to ask questions are the kids that already have some background knowledge about that. So I love to use an image or a quote or a video clip or an audio clip, use something to pique interest, right? I really like, personally, images, because anybody can ask a question about a picture. I can even ask why things are colored different ways, or why this person's over there when this person's over here. And sometimes a bigger piece of text, especially if it's like a paragraph, that may be a little divisive. If my comprehension isn't at grade level, maybe I'd feel a little intimidated, right? So you can use quotes or phrases or text, absolutely. When you first get started, I love using pictures to kind of level the playing field and get everybody comfortable with that. And if we let our kids look at something like that and then generate some questions, I think it's great to show them how their questions can connect to whatever the essential questions we had thought out previously are, right? Here's what I think we should be focusing on this unit. And look, you guys came up with these questions. They're focused along a similar line. We also need to provide multiple methods for our students to access and understand information. So textbooks aren't necessarily inherently bad, right? But we shouldn't use just our textbook as a source. So can I incorporate other primary sources or some other secondary sources even? Are there a variety of perspectives I can pull in? Somebody had an interesting idea at a workshop once. If we're studying the Revolutionary War, I wonder if there's any sources from Britain's perspective on the Revolutionary War, right? What do they say about that? This is also a great spot to start discussing validity of sources and bias. Even our youngest kids can start to say, hey, you know, this says it was written by Joe Schmo on the internet. Maybe it's not the most accurate, right? Our youngest students can even start to ask those questions as well. I think it's also important to plan a few different activities in the course of the unit that allow our students to interact with the information and work on that drawing conclusions piece. And again, it's hard. It's maybe not something they'll get immediately that first time, but helping them through that is going to be very important. And then our final goal here is to ensure that our assessments are matching our learning objectives from the unit. So what's the best way, rethinking maybe, how our students can demonstrate all that they've learned? What format or combination of formats is best suited to show that learning? And then think about, is there this opportunity to take action? The standards don't require that of every unit, but we do want several times, hopefully in the course of a year, our students to take some action based on their learning. And that can be beyond their classroom somewhere, like to the other third grade classrooms, to the school, or bigger picture to like state government or town council or whatever that might be applicable to what you're studying, okay? Kind of keep that in mind as well. So just a few reminders before I show you a few helpful resources. Remember, they're not forcing you to throw out the content you've been teaching previously. They may just be asking you to rethink how your students are learning about that information in your class. So what is the student's role in my classroom? Are they passive absorbers of information, or are they active participants in the learning process? Sort of shifting that cognitive load to our students. Keep in mind, those are things like asking questions, learning to discover the answers, right? Communicating their ideas. And the biggest takeaway I can possibly stress to you is that our inquiry is going to go hand in hand with the content. So working together, our students are going to learn how to do inquiry about the content to hopefully shape who they are in the future and who they are as citizens, and their ability to think about and solve some issues. Now, I know that was quick. That was just sort of our brief overview. Before we move on to talk about any resources, does anybody have any questions that I can clear up? So today, we're going to focus on some resources that are on our...
Catherine?
Oh, sorry.
I apologize. I muted myself.
No, you're okay.
All right.
Go ahead, Rich.
Here's actually my question. So as I was going through working at just a specific project, one of the parts of that is the kids were exploring their own essential questions and their own supporting questions.
Okay.
And as they were working through the process, I kind of discovered that we almost need to support this kind of thing with language arts standards as well, because they go hand in hand, and it gives us kind of double dipping. And it, through I discovered weaknesses through the process, and actually talk with the language arts teacher to find out how we could co-build these units, so it makes more sense.
That's awesome.
I see by your head shaking that that's something we should be doing.
I like that. No, that's wonderful. And Kathy's super excited as our ELA and social studies person. Rich, can I ask, what grade do you teach? Are you middle school, it sounds like, or high school?
I teach fifth grade, but at our school, fifth grade is part of basically our middle school model. The kids are moving from class to class. And yeah, our standard is found within the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade as well.
And, we've been hearing for years as social science people that we're also language arts teachers, which, sorry, we don't always love, but it's accurate though, right? If our kids are digesting that information and sorting through a variety of sources, they're going to have to use some of their writing skills, and they're going to have to use their speaking and listening skills to have communication with each other. And obviously we're reading informational text. So you're absolutely right. There is already some overlap. And then when you dive into an inquiry process like this, you're going to notice more, I think. Absolutely.
Well, I had one more question, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely.
And it's around assessment. I do assessments usually through projects, sometimes through traditional testing with essays, but I'm really having trouble with the developing some of the formative and especially the summative when we're doing these circles and these communications, because I think that's where the real learning happens, is when the kids are exploring the content with each other. Yeah. And I personally am having a hard time with developing that particular kind of summation.
So let me make sure I'm understanding. First of all, you're not alone. That's a hard piece. And it is a change sometimes from what we've been used to, right? When you're talking are you doing almost like literature circles kind of, or like this group work on a project?
Well, an example, we just watched a movie called Agony and Ecstasy, which is about the painting of the Sistine Chapel. Mm-hmm. And today, we with the burning down of the Notre Dame fire, I decided to go ahead and re-explore this with the kids. I wanted them to be able to examine how they would feel if we lost the Sistine Chapel, because now they value what went into it. And I just wanted to explore that avenue, because there's a social connection, because they understand what went into it. And the value, Michelangelo's no longer with us. Cannot be you can make it a copy, but it would never be the same. And I wanted them to talk through that.
Gotcha. So I gotcha. So the tricky part is sometimes I think one piece is, do we need to give everything a grade, or is your formative assessment along the way more of the observation of what your students are processing and doing, and who's struggling with that and who's not, kind of like those anecdotal notes, which I know doesn't have the grade book part. But sometimes we can look at a few different things. I do have some resources for rubric creation that might be helpful depending on what you're doing, but I'll show you here in just a minute when we get to the resource websites, if that's okay. I'll make sure to point those out. That sounds great. Does anybody else have any questions about the standards before we dive into some resources? Trying to see all your faces. Sorry, I have to scroll for you. Okay, so this is our Social Science in Action webpage, and our whole group of content specialists has a page called ilclassroomsinaction.org. So our social science page builds off that and is called ilsocialscienceinaction.org. And hopefully you're familiar with this, but if not, let me give you a little brief overview. We're going to start way over here at the right. Connect with us is the place to sign up to join our listserv if you'd like. If you want to see all the smiling faces of our content specialists or find their contact information for perhaps other subject areas, you can click on that second link. The teacher's newsletter, every month we put out a newsletter about different topics. That is posted in some archived versions there under the teacher's newsletter. If you want to look at our social media feeds to find us or fill out a contact form, there's some information there under that Connect with Us button that you can take a look at for those. hopefully, maybe not, because you may have gotten this, a lot of you got this information from our listserv, but our next little heading to the left there is the IL Social Studies Com button. I'm going to click on that page to just show you what that looks like for a second in case you joined from our listserv. So this page, every time we have a new session, is going to be uploaded here at the top so that you can see what our upcoming IL Social Studies Com virtual events are. There's a little discussion board here. Any resources we share will start a new row here to talk about today's IL Social Studies Com. So if you have questions after the fact that you thought of, feel free to come on back here and ask those questions, and Kathy or I or both of us will get back to you. And then if you scroll down, the video recording of today's session and future sessions are going to be posted down here in the archives for you. So if you forgot a resource and you want to jump ahead to when we talked about it, you're welcome to come back and take a look there as well. Okay? I'm going to scroll all the way back up for you. The next heading to the left is professional learning. And that talks about, we have a few things. Professional learning materials are items that you could take back to your school if you needed to lead a professional learning activity there. So like a PowerPoint with a facilitation guide or a webinar with a facilitation guide. Professional learning opportunities talk about upcoming events that the content specialists are doing. There's a link to ISB's page where they list events around the state as well. And then if we've ever come to your area and done a presentation in person, those are housed under past social studies presentations. So if you've seen us present in person somewhere, those will be housed there. We're going to spend most of our time today living here under this resources button because there's a few things here that are going to be really helpful. Our social emotional learning under resources will take you to the page run by our social emotional learning content specialists who are on the call, Kevin and Lisa. They can wave. Nice to see you all this afternoon. So if you're looking for resources surrounding social emotional learning, that will take you to their page for that. We're going to focus today on our social studies resources. So the first place I want to take you here is Illinois resources. I realize this may be confusing. Here's how we tried to do the distinction. Illinois resources are resources created specifically for Illinois and aligned specifically to our standards. So basically things that Kathy or I or our team have developed. Resource websites could be external sources aligned to the C3 framework, so they'd be close to our standards, but maybe the numbers wouldn't match, right? They'd be on the same path there. We're going to start with Illinois resources. So I'm going to click there for you. And it's going to go really slow because I'm on a video call. Okay. So this, every time we add new resources, we'll add them here at the top for you. The older resources will be a little bit farther down. That doesn't mean they're bad. They're still pretty awesome. You should take a look. So there are a few things that are relatively new that I'm not sure you're aware of. Is anybody on the call, are you a curriculum director, instructional coach sort of person? Does that apply to anyone or most of you teachers today? It looks like most teachers. Okay, this needs assessment might be helpful if you want to look at what kind of professional learning your district might need. So that might be helpful for those instructional coaches on our call. But one of the first things I wanted to show you was these analyzing social science source packets. So we talked about that we should use a variety of sources in the social studies classes, but what does that actually mean, right? Like, what do I do with, I can bring this document in, but now what? So these sources were created. I'm going to click on the 3.5 version for you here for just a second. These source packets were created to try to give you some ideas about what to do. So for example, for each different type of source, like a written document, there's some information about it, what it is. There's some great tips to help you, questions to ask your students when you analyze that, strengths and limitations of the document. And then for each different grade band, there's at least one, if not two, graphic organizers or potential graphic organizers that you could use or modify to analyze that type of source. So if we're talking about, I know in middle school and high school, political cartoons, some people assume are easier to analyze than they really are, right? Our kids don't always get those innuendos and implications. So in the 612 packet talks a little bit about analyzing political cartoons and some graphic organizers to help with that. Our 3.5 one here talks about analyzing posters. So if you're looking for some potential graphic organizers to use with different types of sources, this is one great resource. I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom for you because Kathy so wisely also included, there we go. At the very end of each grade band packet, there's 2 or 3 lessons, is that right? Mm-hmm. Using sources, many of them are adapted from the Library of Congress, that you could use in your, this one, 3rd through 5th grade classroom to talk about these sources in the classroom and how they could be incorporated. So there's a few different options there at the end that may be worth investigating for you as well. All right, I'm going to take you back to our page to take a look at something. So those are the source packets. There's a K2 packet, a 3-5, and a 6-12. So you can use those depending on your grade band as needed. Our next resource is just for K5 teachers. Sorry, 6-12 people. Maybe we'll work on that one soon. Yeah, that's in the works. So these, let's pick 1st grade. These are, what are some ideas of literature connected to the social science standards? So we know that in the elementary grades, not everybody has a block set aside for social studies. And while just reading a book about a social studies topic isn't enough to accomplish that standard for social science, I can use a piece of children's literature to launch a further investigation. So that's what the goal of this packet is. And it is by no means an all-inclusive list. There are tons of great literature out there. Kathy and I find new books every other day that we need to add to the packet. So keep checking back. I'm sure they'll be updated as well. The goal of this is there's some books for each grade level that talk about inspiring kids to take action. So what are some great children's lit books that talk about that taking informed action piece? And then Kathy also put in, for every standard at that grade level, every disciplinary concept at that grade level, here are some potential children's books that you could use to launch some investigations. So again, ideas are there to get you started and launched down a path if you're looking to use children's literature as kind of a springboard into a unit for social studies. Did I miss anything? Sorry, I should have let you talk.
That's great. I mean, even just read alouds in your classroom can build some background knowledge about the topic as you're looking for more resources about something in social science you haven't developed a unit or a lesson for. So the more you can read nonfiction as read alouds, the more kids are more apt to learn about that topic, as well as here's some great read alouds.
Yes. So that's one of our, I would say, relatively new resources that came out here this school year that we wanted to share with you. All right, let me take you back here. There's one more favorite, and it looks like it might be a favorite of some other people. I saw that this one, when I was tinkering around, had a lot of hits that people were taking a look at. So one of the things we hear a lot or heard a lot was, all right, I know I'm supposed to do inquiry, but I don't really know what that means or what that looks like. So we've been working on some resources to help you with that. This resource, these inquiry process graphics, I'm going to click on the middle school one for you. They essentially walk you through a 5-stage inquiry process. So first I need to get my kids engaged and asking questions. That's our blue box. And then our red box is, how can I get my students to think critically? Green is drawing conclusions. So how can I help my students to draw conclusions? Yellow is communicating findings. And then there should always be a reflection piece at the end. So our last component there is, how can I reflect upon this process? And this graphic is really listing prompts for you to think about as you're planning a unit. Does that make sense? Like steps you might need, thoughts you might need to think through when you lay out a unit of inquiry. Our next Illinois Social Studies Com in May is going to delve into inquiry a little bit more. And right now it says a not yet released resource. We have a very close to finished resource about the inquiry process and inquiry strategies that we're going to hopefully share with you at our next Illinois Social Studies Com. These also, on the back of the middle school ones, it has information there about inquiry and the inquiry standards that you're addressing. On the back of each of these, let me jump back to our resources page. On the back of each of the elementary pages on the front there, you can see have a little box. That's the inquiry skills for the elementary. They're on the front. And then on the back are the elementary disciplinary concepts. So as an elementary teacher, you could take your grade level graphic as well to kind of take a look at all of those things. those are the three big resources that I wanted to highlight for you on this page. There are some other things down below that may be helpful. The implementation guide, where are we as a school or a district in the process of implementing the standards? Where can I expect some growth? Danielson correlation is really to help you think about personally, where am I at and what can I be doing? And then there's some other resources down here. This quality review rubric is sort of an equip-like rubric for social studies, right? How do I look at lessons and resources as well? There's a ton more stuff on here, but I'm already going to run out of time, I'm sure. So, questions about anything on that page? I'm going to give you a moment here. Everybody okay? Sorry, I'm scrolling through to see if anybody looks like they're about to speak. Okay, we're going to go back to resources and go to resource websites. There's a few things here that are some of my favorites that we're going to share with you. That does not mean that they're the only things available. This site is set up, there's so many different resources on here that they're kind of in these collapsible accordion lists. So I'm going to click on general resources just to show you what they look like. There's a few different links to some of the Illinois State Board's websites. Their Teach, Talk, Learn, their Born, Built, Grown is about the Executive Mansion resources as well. Okay, so the top here has some sort of general, let me collapse this for you. Has some general resources, some assessment resources. So, I lost them. Rich, some of those assessment resources here that might be helpful for you. C3 has a performance-based clearinghouse that you may or may not have seen. They list some of the same things we do. They sometimes update theirs a little differently. That's the first source. This Assessment Resource Center for History gives you like standard multiple choice questions, kind of projects to assess things, and then something they call extended multiple choice, or it looks, for lack of a better descriptor, PARC-like, or the Illinois Assessment of Readiness-like, here's a multiple choice question, but how can you support what you've learned as well? And they give you some samples there too, so that could be a leaping off point. Beyond the Bubble is one of my favorites, and I'll show you that in just a second. But ThemeSpark is the one that might help if you're looking to build a rubric for something. So I will click on that for just a second to show you that. Oh, I didn't log into my account though. So ThemeSpark lets you make rubrics, but the catch is they don't have our standards loaded. You'll have to align it to the C3 framework. So, yep, okay, or not. So you can go in though, if you're looking for some of those inquiry skills standards. Some of those are almost word for word from the C3 framework. We've just kind of adjusted what grade level they fall at. So you could kind of pick and choose the categories you're looking for and build some rubrics or get a starting point if you're looking for a rubric for something like gauging a discussion, right? So I think that's a great one. Beyond the Bubble comes from one of my favorite sites ever. How many of you are familiar? Is anybody familiar with Stanford History Education Group? Are there any middle school, high school people on here? Because you should like that a lot. So Beyond the Bubble is from the Stanford History Education Group. And Stanford History Education Group has 3 different categories on this site. Read Like a Historian is one of my favorite kind of history things. If you're looking for something to supplement your curriculum, I would say maybe 5th grade and up probably would be great. These are mostly written for middle school, high school. You could maybe adapt the Read Like a Historian for your grade level. They kind of come with sources and a task all bundled together on different topics for you. So if you're looking for a way to incorporate some of those primary sources, you have to register for a free account, but they have bundles of those there for you as well. Beyond the Bubble, they came out with, I want to say, a year and a half ago, and it's really cool because they're trying to pair their primary sources or primary sources from the Library of Congress with an assessment task. So some of those are things like assessing the validity of a source. Like if I look at a painting about the first Thanksgiving that was painted in 1932, can I use that to learn about what happened? Well, we want our kids to figure out maybe not, right? Maybe that person researched it, but maybe they didn't. So some of those are tasks like that, and they build assessments for you about that. And this civic online reasoning is sort of a helping students to sift through everything they can learn online, sort of sift through the fake news, the false claims, the misleading arguments. So they've come up with some tasks, and this one is kind of still in development. I'll tell you, they're coming out with new lessons and tasks more and more every day. They launched this maybe 5 or 6 months ago, and they're kind of generating more as they keep going. But this comes from that Stanford History Education Group, and they have some wonderful, rich resources that are really helpful to support those areas of learning in your classroom. So those are some of our assessment ones. I'm not going to dive into all of them for every other category, I promise. So don't get scared when you see how many there are. Primary and secondary sources. I want to show you one of my favorites here is this Docs Teach. And the reason I love it so much, it's from the National Archives, which we know is a great resource for things. My problem is, I also know Library of Congress is awesome, right? I kind of go down the rabbit hole. Like, I start to try to look for a source to use in my classroom to go with my textbook, and then I get lost in this sea of sources, and I don't know what to pick. So I really like, for my, I guess, scatterbrain diving in and getting lost situation, I love Docs Teach because you can, again, create a free account, and then off on the side here, you can search activities, lets you search activities other people have made. So they've paired a document from National Archives or an image from National Archives with something, questions or whatever. Or once you have a free account, you can make your own. So I can select making connections, and it will kind of prompt me with some questions that I could ask my kids. You could build it online for them and let them do it online, or you could print it. They even have, I forget what they call their categories, but it's like a lower elementary, middle elementary, or high school kind of. You can tailor the questions to your students' ability levels. And then once you've created these activities, you can kind of save them in your account. So I like, again, because I get lost in just the raw searching, I love that this one gives me the ability to create a discussion topic about something or help my kids to analyze documents, right? So they give us kind of that structure that I'm not always so sure of when I find a source that I think looks cool. So this is one of my favorites. I would say it's not the thing to do 10 minutes before your kids walk in the room, because it took me a little bit of time to figure out which activity I wanted to do and which picture I wanted to use. But it really does walk you through it pretty well. So that is one of my favorites. In here, you'll also see back on our website some of the great ones that I mentioned. The Smithsonian is here. Their Learning Lab is sort of similar to Docs Teach. I don't think it has as many cool like question prompts. And the Library of Congress is here. If you're a world history teacher, which I was for like 10 years, the World Digital Library is about the only source I found that has some primary sources for you to take a look at as well. And Gilder-Lehrman is here. Those Gilder-Lehrman, Library of Congress, National Archives are wonderful to find those raw sources. Again, my favorite is the Docs Teach personally, just because it helps focus me a little bit, if that makes sense. Those are all the categories we have at the top right now. But down here, under this other green bar, I tried to sort the rest of the resources based on the area of the standards they might help you on the most. They overlap a lot, obviously, so they're not exclusive. But if you're looking for some resources about inquiry, you can take a look at some of these resources as well. One of my favorites is the Right Question Institute. They have a great process to get the kids engaged and asking questions so that they can help to develop those essential questions. There's some great videos on the teaching channel about what inquiry might look like in the classroom. And of course, the C3 Teachers website has some pre-written inquiries that you can search that other states have done that are aligned to the C3 framework as well. Civics resources. Some of my favorites, civics resources. Up at the top here, Illinois Civics. If you are a high school teacher who has that new civics mandate, and there's the new middle school mandate that's making its way through the state house, this will probably be the source, my guess is, for the middle school as well, because the McCormick Foundation runs this, and they are lined up in the legislation to hopefully support that if that goes through. So that's a great resource to find a civic mentor in your area, to find some trainings that are in your area as well. And if you teach other grades, not just high school, iCivics is one of my favorites. And it was one of my students' favorites in the classroom. I don't know if anybody else has used it. My kids loved to play the games at like the, last free Friday before lunch sort of situation. But they really do have some great and interesting lessons and units that they've bundled together around civics topics as well. And they've written them for high school and middle school in a lot of cases that are great to take a look at. I don't know about you, but geography and economics were the two that I wasn't always, seemed a little overwhelming at first, right? So economics, Econ Illinois is our kind of local Illinois organization that does some trainings. If you want to contact them, they do some wonderful trainings around that. One of my favorite places, though, to look for economics lessons and units is the St. Louis Fed. They have an Econ Ed portal, and you can search by grade level or by topic. And I know that I got into social science because I loved history, so economics seemed too mathy for me. Sorry, math people. Seemed a little overwhelming, right? When I was told I kind of had to teach that too, I was like, whoa, okay. So I love some of these. Some of them, like Kathy and I talked about earlier, the Children's Lit, some of these econ lessons are tied to Children's Lit, which is a great thing to be able to use that as a building block to launch into something that we're maybe not as familiar with. And then I already showed you my favorite history resource. The history resources, my absolute, like I said, one of my favorites here is the Stanford History Education Group. Their Read Like a Historian project is wonderful. High school has some great Facing History in Ourselves. It has some awesome resources. And then there's just some other cool ones in here that talk about Voices of Democracy lets you hear historical speeches. Like how cool is that we can look at those things with our students as well. I know that this is not even scraping the tip of the iceberg about all the resources that exist out there for everyone to use. We do just have a few minutes left. Does anybody have a different favorite resource that they wanted to share? Like, is there something that you found really helpful in your classroom to help support the social sciences that you'd love to share with the rest of us? Practicing my wait time. Can you tell? I don't, because I just talk like this because I get nervous about the waiting.
I wonder if anybody's used any of ours or any of the ones.
You know what? I don't want you to be all alone. This may sound kind of crazy, but one of the resources that I've actually incorporated this year is the students themselves. I'll ask them questions, and they bring new stuff in all the time.
Awesome.
And I tell them on a regular basis that my class next year, a big chunk of it was influenced by the stuff they brought in and the things they've suggested, because it opens their engagement, which is really what I think this is all about.
Absolutely. I love that, Rich. That's great. Yeah, our whole goal is to get our kids engaged in our class and talking to them about what they've heard or their interests, what information they have. That's a great way to tap into kind of their knowledge as well. I love that. Anybody else have any information or resources or ideas you've used that you really love? Okay. In the chat window, I did paste, again, the post survey for you. We'd love to be able to keep providing these for you throughout the year. And there's a question on there about how you'd like to approach the summer. So would you like to pause for the summer? Do you want to read different timing for the summer? So we'd love to hear a little bit from you. There's just a few questions on there we'd like some feedback from you about so that we can keep providing these. Our next ILSSCom is coming up in May, and I believe the topic of that one is inquiry strategies and kind of specific things to help support those different pieces of the inquiry process. And we'll have that new resource to share with you as well. You'll hopefully get to be some of the first people to get to see that. So we greatly appreciate you all joining us live today, and we hope to see you back in future months. Okay? Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Patty.
Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Awesome.